doing the research for tonight's presentation, and being willing to share with us. He comes to us from the experience of a homicide detective in the Houston Police Department, and is using his investigative experience to delve into matters of creation science. And he's a deep thinker, and I'm sure that'll be evident this evening. He does have a Doctor of Biblical Studies degree from Trinity Graduate School, Apologetics and Geology. What city is that located in?
It's in India.
In India. No wonder I didn't know where it was. And a PhD in Christian Apologetics.
It's in Indiana.
From Newburgh Seminary. A little closer. So India and Indiana. Okay. So tonight's presentation is the origin of Darwin's origin story. And that's an intriguing title there. I'm thinking you're going to confirm what I've already heard about Darwin's origin, on the Origin of Species book, and where that came from. So I won't steal your thunder on that. We'll just let you come up, and if you'd help me give him a nice Neos welcome.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. And we're going to have a little talk. We have time for questions and comments afterwards. And if you have a question during this time, you can raise your hand. We'll try to explain something, but we'll try not to go too deep. But I decided to come up with the idea of the origin of Darwin's origin myth. It's based kind of on his book, The Origin of the Species, but he really doesn't talk about the origin of the species. He has an origin story that we came from primitive creatures and evolved, slowly advancing until we got to humans. And so we're going to look at it. It's thought by most people that it was an original scientific conclusion that Darwin came to. He promoted it as that, as we'll see, but and they think it wasn't before him. The idea wasn't around, and it was totally based on science. And when I talk to atheists, they all agree, but the shocking thing is, I'd say the vast majority of Christians also think the same thing. So we're going to look at it and kind of make the case, was it an original story or not? And I did some detective work, I looked into it, I'm not an expert on it, I enjoy doing research and detective work. And so I want to talk a little bit about detective work and what detectives do. And they do historical science or origin science. How did it get here? What happened to make it like this? And so one important thing that I like to emphasize that people don't talk about anymore is the law of cause and effect. And here's a quote. The law of cause and effect is an immutable universal law encompassing the principle that nothing in the universe can ever happen by chance. For everything that happens, in other words, every effect, there is always a corresponding adequate cause preceding it without exception. The principle of cause and effect is and always has been accepted throughout the ages as the most exalted universal law, and one always to be totally respected. We don't respect it in our culture anymore because it's a big problem. If you have an effect that's apparently bigger than the cause, you got a wrong idea. It just doesn't work. And so, advancing from an amoeba, what was the cause that allowed it to become complex and become humans, have brains and internal organs and all these things, and it violates the law of cause and effect. But what detectives do, that's what you use. You look at the effect and then try to figure out what the cause is and how did it get that way. With operational science, they look at cause and effect. So if I tell you, for example, prove to me that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius, go out there and prove it. You can do it scientifically using observational science. Okay, but how did the fossil record get there? That is using just looking at the effect and trying to argue back to the cause. And that's largely philosophical. And a lot of people are afraid of philosophical. Philosophy is just thinking. It's just using rational reasoning, logic, and things like that. So That's what a detective does, is comes to a philosophical conclusion. And there's 3 basic tests for philosophical truth. The first is logical consistency. Does it make sense? And so, for example, if we have a murder where a guy's murdered and he's carried up 4 flights of stairs, and we have 2 possible suspects, either a 100-pound woman or 4 200-pound men that are bodybuilders. Which one is going to be logical? Drug them up the stairs.
The woman. But see, that's obvious. I mean, the 2 big guys, yeah, they could do it. But no, she did it.
That's it. And then you have to have empirical adequacy. It's like you have to look at the evidence and make sure that it proves your philosophical point, and you have to be able to explain all the evidence. So if you have let's say a burglary, and then you find a fingerprint inside, then you have to find out who this fingerprint goes to, and that's what the scientists do. But then when you find out who it is, you start doing some investigating, and we do things like, was his cell phone in the area at the time? We find out yes. We look for surveillance videos around there. We see his car driving in there, and then we see that there was no forced entry. So we find out that his mother was cleaning that same house, and she had a key, and now the key's missing. I think we now have adequate empirical adequacy. Once you charge him, Brad's a detective too. So, and then it's got to be experiential relevance. So I've driven back and forth from Houston more than a few times, and anyway, if they say they had a guy from Houston came up and drove to Dallas and committed a murder and then went back, and then he had an excuse and he was only missing for 2 hours, I'm like, he didn't drive that far. Because my experience can tell me that. I don't have to look into it unless he got an airplane or something. You just couldn't do it. So logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. And I want to talk a little bit about types of evidence, and this is what you do with origin science. There's 2 types. There's direct evidence, which is eyewitness testimony, videotape, surveillance, confessions, witness statements, these type of things. And then there's circumstantial evidence, which is physical and biological evidence, basically. There's other subcategories, but that's basically what it all is. And what detectives do is we get the circumstantial evidence, and we can get some help with forensic science doing it, and that's where science plays a part in origin science. But what we have to do is figure out the circumstances of how it got there. How did it get there? What happened? You do that with a fossil record. What were the circumstances of how it got there? And I think that's one part that's a big problem with science today, is that they have a lot of people looking at little areas. And everybody's kind of like, well, the big picture, we know the big picture's a fact, I just got to defend my little area. And nobody's really so much looking at the big picture. But that's what a detective does, is they get all the evidence together and bring it together and present it to the jury and the district attorney. They love the detective because they can present the story. And that's what, considering all the evidence and then coming to the conclusion, being able to make the case. So that's important, I think, and that's what I try to do as a creation detective. So I want to talk just a little bit about faith now. The world today tells us that our faith is irrational, and that's what faith means, believing something that's totally irrational, illogical, against all the evidence. And they have facts. But that's not what the Bible's definition is, and so I'm going to go with the Bible, and it says, Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the substance of things hoped for. That's confidence in the future. We hope that Jesus is going to come again. We hope the sun's going to come up tomorrow. You have confidence in the future. The evidence of things not seen. It's evidence. When we don't have evidence for the flood, we have evidence for the flood, and we have to interpret it, and we come to the most reasonable conclusion is what we believe. We have come to the most reasonable conclusion based on the evidence. And so they're coming to a different conclusion based on the evidence, but it's a faith-based conclusion. And when juries convict someone, they're asked to convict them beyond a reasonable doubt because it's origin science, and the closest you can get is the most reasonable model, basically, is what science, I think, calls it. So, anyway, here's a basic statement, very important. Christians don't deny science, they deny bad science. It's not religion versus science, but good science versus bad science. Christians don't deny the evidence, they deny the atheist interpretation of the evidence, the conclusion that they come to based on the evidence. We just come to a different conclusion. And atheists aren't so interested in the evidence, as we see from this quote from Richard Dawkins. He said, even if there were no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, we should still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories. I wouldn't say that. I've investigated the evidence. It points to the Bible, to the Creator God, to there being a flood here about 4,500 years ago. They're not interested in the evidence. I'm saying follow the evidence. Here's a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle, and he wrote Sherlock Holmes, of course, but he comes to a very true statement about detective work. And he says it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has the data. Insensibly, one begins to twist the facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. So that's what happened, I think, with Darwin. He took and twisted the facts and came in with a theory before he started in his investigation. And that's what I'm going to try to make the case with tonight. And so a good detective, you go in and look at the evidence and come to the most reasonable conclusion. Okay, and that's what I have done. And most Christians today believe in theistic evolution, so I shouldn't have any problem coming to the conclusion of theistic evolution if that was true, but the evidence doesn't point to that, and we're going to look at that a little bit tonight. So evolutionists today argue that evolution is a modern idea, a product of scientific research, in part as an effort to lend credibility to their hypothesis. And I think this is exactly what's been going on. And this is what Darwin did. He sold it as a new idea based on science in order to get people to say, hey, we got modern science now. Now we've come to a new conclusion. We've disproved all these other ideas, but it was pseudoscience validating an old idea. Michael Fitch, he said, not until Darwin did anyone draw the same conclusion, except Alfred R. Wallace. A lot of people are believing, I know that Alfred R. Wallace came up with the idea before Darwin, but Darwin undoubtedly preceded him in the concept of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But Wallace sent a paper to Darwin about 10 months before he published his work, and a lot of people saying, hey, you should have acknowledged him or something like that, but now they say, well, he didn't have the idea of natural selection. But here's from his paper: I was suffering from a sharp attack of intermittent fever, and every day during the cold and succeeding hot fits had to lie down for several hours. Then it suddenly flashed upon me that the fittest would survive. I became convinced that I had at length found the long sought for law of nature which solves the problem of the origin of the species. I wonder how much Darwin got from Alfred Wallace, but he got it from a lot of other people. The idea was around for a long time. And one of the most notable that we can connect Darwin to is Edwin Blyth. And he was an English chemist and zoologist, and he wrote 3 major articles on natural selection that were published in the magazine of natural history from 1835 to 1837. And he was a Christian and what we call a creationist, and Blyth correctly saw the concept of natural selection as preserving the status quo, the created kind. He saw natural selection as a process of culling, that is, choosing between several traits, all of which must first be in existence before they can survive. So he's saying that, hey, the first of the kind was information-rich genetically, as we'd say today, but had all this information. Say it was a dog, it had genetic information for long hair and short hair, and large dogs and small dogs, but as it branched out, and the genes for small dog came forward, and then they mate with another small dog, then they're going to lose the chance to become a big dog unless they mate with another dog. And so he saw natural selection as a way of the best of the kind surviving. So if a deer had a genetic problem, and then the wolf would more than likely catch that one. So these genetic problems could be kind of culled and brought into, and the kind would be preserved. And I think he was right in what he did. Within Darwin's library, housed in the archives of Cambridge University, there are copies of the magazine that contain Blyth's article, which Darwin's handwritten notes in the margin. It seems that Darwin took this reasonable theory proposed by Blyth and twisted the concept of natural selection to meet his idea. And so it wasn't a new idea. And here's a point of science that I want to bring up. If your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in humiliation. That's Arthur Eddington, fellow scientist with Einstein. So the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of energy, and that energy cannot be created or destroyed. The second law is the deterioration or degrading of energy, that energy is constantly winding down, but it also says that things are winding down, that things are not getting better, that they're getting worse, that things go from order to disorder. And this goes against, goes with Blyth's idea, is consistent with the second law of thermodynamics, and Darwin's idea, it goes against this basic theory. This is a fundamental law of science. Another one who talked about this was Frenchman Denis Diderot, taught that all animals evolved from one primeval organism. This prototype organism was fashioned into all those types of animals alive today via natural selection. This was over 100 years before Darwin. Another idea he came up with came from Charles Lyell, and he published his book of Principles of Geology in 1830 that explains the theory of uniformitarianism, that geological processes we see today shaped the earth long ago as well. So Lyell was a good friend with Darwin. They correspond back and forth, but he came up with this idea of uniformitarianism, gradualism. And his evidence for it was that the laws of physics don't change. Why would we think anything in geology would have changed rapidly in the past? And so that was his evidence. He didn't look at the fossil record and came up with this conclusion. That was his only evidence, and he used rhetoric as a trial lawyer, which he was. He wasn't a geologist. He's an amateur geologist and a trial lawyer. He used rhetoric to attack the Bible's idea of the earth being not that old, about 6,000 years old, and that there was a worldwide flood. That's all he did. He had attacked the idea, and his goal was to free science from Moses. He didn't like the idea that science before this was, the geologists were all catastrophists, which they believed it was a result of a catastrophe, and he just wanted to attack the science validating the Bible idea. And he did an excellent job without ever mentioning the Bible. I think he did more damage to the Bible than anyone in history without ever mentioning the Bible. And anyway, Lyell's idea in geology influenced Darwin to think in terms of millions of years. And the problem was, when Lyell's book came out, it was accepted and eventually was taught in all of the schools of geology, and it was considered to be settled science again. So Darwin went into his voyage with the ideas and in terms of millions of years, and all these ideas that I'm going to look at, similar to evolution, all involve billions of years and an eternal universe. And just referring to his voyage on the Beagle, Darwin writes, I brought with me the first volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology, which I studied attentively, and his work was of the highest service to me in many ways. He did acknowledge Lyell in his book. He didn't really acknowledge anybody else in his book as getting information from. He named Francis Bacon and also Aristotle, but didn't really give them much information. Later on, he did mentioned some more names after the 6th edition, but when he first came out, he was said, hey, this is a brand new idea to try to do, but he got a settled science from Lyell. Just, is it settled science? Here's something from ICR, because ICR is the seminal work in this area. And the very fact that fossils exist testify to sudden and catastrophic burial beneath vast sediments before the living things had a chance to rot or get scavenged by hungry critters. So we have a picture of a fish being eaten by another fish. So it obviously points to rapid burial. And as a homicide detective, I know even human bodies, if they're laid outside in the woods and nobody finds them, they deteriorate rapidly. And we actually were so surprised one deteriorated so fast, we decided to do an experiment. And we took a pig and put all chicken wire around it so no animals could tear it up, and just watch it deteriorate. And it was amazing how fast it deteriorated. And fish, I lived on Lake Michigan growing up, close to Lake Michigan anyway, and fish deteriorate rapidly. They're gone within 2 weeks on the bottom. So this whole idea that they've laid around for thousands of years just is not good science. There's all kinds of problems. We're finding soft tissue in the dinosaurs, DNA in the dinosaurs, bones and all these problems, and they're finding carbon-14 and everything. The RATE team has done just a wonderful job in showing that the fossil record doesn't represent long periods of time. Darwin admitted there'd be a problem. He said the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated or organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. He knew there was a problem with it, and we haven't found the missing links yet. People will try to tell you, and they come up with an idea of punctuated equilibrium and all this stuff, but that's another unscientific idea.
It's calling it my theory there, my theory. Not giving credit to any of these other authors that you were mentioning.
Yeah, my theory. Yeah, good point. My theory. And here's fossil expert Gareth Nelson. He says the idea that one could go to the fossil record and expect to empirically recover an ancestor-descendant sequence, be it a species, genera, family, or whatever, has been and continues to be a pernicious illusion. That's a crazy idea, basically, is what he says. But Hutton, John Hutton did give the ideas to Lyell, and he was a geologist, and he did show that the fossil record represented an ancestor-descendant sequence. And that idea does go back a long ways. Lyell didn't really talk about anything. Here's a quote from Stephen Gould. For the scientists of the 19th century, natural cataclysm seemed as threatening as a reign of terror. Contrary to popular myths, Darwin and Lyell were not the heroes of true science, defending objectivity. Catastrophists were as committed to science as any gradualists. In fact, they adopted the more objective view. They were the better scientists, they were the better detectives. The idea that uniformitarianism, gradualism is just a lie. It really isn't true. The first person known to have explicitly recognized fossils as a memorial of geological change and succession of life was evidently Xenophanes. He's a Greek philosopher, 500 years, about 2,000 years before Darwin, 500 years before Christ. So it's not a new idea, this whole fossil record representing long ages. Another important thing that nobody talks about much anymore is chapter 10 in Darwin's book. This is called Pangenesis. And basically what he thought was, he got it from Lamarckian, but Lamarckian got it from other people, and Darwin, I'll show you, got it, he'll admit that it came from someone else earlier, but basically let me tell you what the idea is, okay? If a creature, like we're going to look at giraffes, if they have a desire to reach higher leaves, they are going to, their cells will give off little information and send it on to their reproduction organs, and anyway, then the next generation will have this new information basically on their desire. And this is Pangenesis. And it was attempted to be confirmed by Francis Galton in the early 1900s. He disproved it, but they stuck with the theory and continued to think that was the power of change. But later on they came up with mutations that proved it totally wrong when they learned about genetics. And now they say mutations is the power behind change, but mutations, we know a lot more about it than we did 75 years ago when we first discovered it, but we know that they don't add any new novel information, no new purposeful information, and they can't really make any positive change, and they would have to do amazing things for all the things that they suppose they do. But like Pangenesis, it was disproved, and they hung onto it over like 40 some years, and they're going to hang on to mutations until they come up with something else. But mutations are another big problem we're not going to go into tonight.
Birth defects.
Was that?
Mutations are birth defects.
Yeah, they're copying errors.
Yeah.
They're going to kill us, you know.
They're not good. They lose information.
Yeah, you lose information, and no new purposeful information comes from mutations. So here, Lamarck came in John Bastet. Lamarck, he had the idea first that they had short necks, and based on desire, basically, is what it was. Darwin came up with the idea of the particles from the cell, which was proven wrong. Here's what Darwin wrote about Hippocrates. Pangenesis was almost identical with mine, merely a change of terms and an application of them to classes of facts necessarily unknown to the old philosophers. So he came up with new science to prove this old idea, and that's where he might have got it from. But it was a bad idea with Hippocrates, with Lamarck, and with Darwin, and now everybody admits it. So we're going to look a little bit at the idea of the good hue by way of the zoo. So I think that's what Ken Ham calls it, but it's biological evolution and the whole story of how we evolved from simple amoebas to complex life forms. And all of these ideas that go all the way back have the assumption that life generated spontaneously. And it's a big problem. Darwin didn't talk about it. He knew it was a problem, and it's still a problem today. And people don't want to talk about it and say, oh, that's not part of evolution. I'm not going to talk about that. No, it's an assumption of evolution. And it goes against the law of biogenesis that Louis Pasteur came up with 3 years after Darwin published his book, and others before him had proven it. And it's never been proven wrong. And it goes against the cell theory. The law of biogenesis says life only can come from life. And the cell theory says cells can only come from cells. So it goes against science, and just that basic assumption is a huge problem. But all these stories we're going to look at have that assumption. And before Darwin, the idea of evolution was called the transmutation of species. And Darwin, he took the same idea and just gave it a new name because he wanted it to look like it was new science. He didn't want it to look like old science. He wanted everybody to think it was a new idea. And even on his big old diary, he had one of his books was the study of transmutation. So he knew about it, and he just did this intentionally, I think, to try to make it look like it's new science. So this was commonly used for evolution ideas before Darwin published his book, when he changed the name to evolution. A couple of biologists who believed in this before Darwin were George Louis Buffon. Expounded the idea at length that the ape and man have a common ancestry, and further, all animals have a common ancestor. And Benoit Millet suggests that fish were precursors of birds, mammals, and men. So these are people, biologists. There's several more. I just gave you a couple to give you an example. There are several more that had this idea. This idea was common in Freemasonry and in other areas before Darwin. Here's the big guy, literally, Erasmus Darwin. He He was a physician, a famous physician. He healed some young boy in England, and he became famous. And he was a natural philosopher, poet, and author. He started the Lunar Society that later transmutated into the Royal Society.
What society?
Royal Society, yeah. And so the Royal Society was around before that, but his big work was Zoonomia, and he also wrote the Botanical Garden and the Temple of Nature. He wrote a lot of poems and had essays on his poems. And this was Darwin's grandfather. He died before Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin originated almost every important idea that has since appeared in evolutionary theory, including natural selection. This is C.D. Arlington. So he had these ideas long before Darwin. In his book, Zoonomia, wrote that all life originated from one common ancestor and over time branched off into all species we see today. He thought this change was driven by competition and sexual selection. He didn't have the Pangenesis idea. I think he got that from Lamarck in chapter 10. He had the idea that we came from shells. He loved shells, and he has a lot of shell collections, and he emblazoned on the Latin phrase, all from shells, on the family coat of arms, just right down the middle were all shells. You can't quite see it. So he had this idea that we came from shells in the past. Young Charles later claimed to have read his grandfather's book so often that he had memorized entire passages. Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life, 2 volumes, 1794 and 1796, has been called the first consistent, all-embracing hypothesis of evolution, and was published some 65 years before Charles published On the Origin of Species in 1859. You think you'd give acknowledgement to your grandfather. You know, what kind of respect is that? And he didn't give any, but the idea surely came from his grandfather. Here's an example of one of his poems, and it's from the Botanic Garden. It said, "Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First form, minute, unseen by spherical glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These a successive generation bloom, new powers acquired and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring, and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing." It's a poem, but you see the idea all right there. He wrote in the Temple of Nature, "All vegetables and animals now existing were originally derived from the smallest microscopic ones, formed by spontaneous vitality in primeval oceans." Goes on to say, "Man should eye with tenderness all living forms, his brother ants and his sister worms." So he thinks that we're all one, that we all came from the same ancestor, and we're all brothers, even with the ants and worms. From D. King Hale, "Almost every topic discussed and example given in Zoonomia reappears in Charles' Origin. In fact, all but one of Charles' books have their counterparts in a chapter of Zoonomia or an essay note of one of Erasmus' poems." Darwin wrote 6 books. One was an autobiography, and I think he didn't use his grandfather's stuff in there. The other 5, he used all his grandfather's stuff. So then we have the Finch's beaks. And the Finch's beak was great evidence that he promoted. We know now that it is a design adaptation feature, it appears to be. And if you go to ICR's website, they got 4 articles in there, just that the genome is able to turn off and turn on the information for a larger beak. And they find once the drought conditions change, the big beaks turned into small beaks again. And so it was a bad idea from the beginning. But the funny thing is, Darwin talked about it. He had all these observations, but they couldn't find one note in any of his journals. So here's what Erasmus wrote. "Some birds have acquired harder beaks to crack nuts, as the parrot. Others have acquired beaks adapted to break harder seeds, as sparrows. Other for the softer seeds of flowers, or the buds of trees, as finches. Other birds have acquired long beaks, other broad ones. All gradually produce during many generations by the perpetual endeavor of the creature to supply the want of food. So that's that desire. So he got his idea from his grandfather, but he lied. He totally lied about it. Another one who came up with this idea was Francis Bacon, who I thought was a Christian, but he was involved in the Freemasonry too, starting in the modern Freemasonry, and he's credited with establishing and popularizing the scientific method. He wrote a paper that was published after his death, and he had the idea in there of evolution, or more specifically transmutation is what he called it, at least in plants and perhaps animals. So this idea went all the way back to the father of modern science, supposedly. He wasn't proud about it, but that's what he believed, and the Freemasonry ran with it. Just in between, Darwin acknowledged and his grandfather acknowledged that some of the ideas were back in the Greek age, but between that, I think the idea was going on. Here's one example from Pliny the Elder. He said that chance herself takes the place of God. She proves that God is uncertain. Same idea goes all the way back into the time of Christ. And so they acknowledge ancient philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy, and they did do us some favors, I think. They looked at all the pagan gods and all the pagan stories, and all the pagan stories of creation were basically the same. And with the pagan gods, they looked at their stories and they found out that all those gods weren't what we would think gods would do. They murdered other gods and raped other gods and stole from other gods and did all these bad things. And they did find one god that was like they expected a god to be, and that was the God of the Hebrews. But the problem with the God of the Hebrews is he said everything was created by nothing. And they said nothing can ever become something. You know, nothing stays nothing. And so that's the reason they do it. But now we have modern secularists are telling us something can come from nothing. But they rejected God of the Bible because of that. And they got most of their ideas from the ancient Hindu. And we'll look at some of their philosophy now. They describe natural causes to what the gods of the pagan stories had, and said that this all happened naturally without any of these gods. These gods were all part of the created universe and all part of the one. And in 520 BC, Greek philosopher Anaximander wrote of a text called On Nature, in which he introduced the idea of evolution, stating that life started as slime in the ocean and eventually moved to drier places. He also brought up the idea that species evolve over time. The presence of shells and marine fossil was for him proof that the seas covered much of the Earth's surface. He got that right. He postulated that humans must have originated in the sea and that originally resembled fish. So that sounds a whole lot about Darwinian evolution. Xenophon studied fossils and put forth various theories on evolution of life. Aristotle studied the marine animals and developed a model of evolution from sea creatures. So all these Greek philosophers had the same basic idea. Another Greek philosopher, he often called the father of evolution naturalism, argued that the chance alone was responsible for the entire process of evolution of simple matter into modern humankind. He says chance did it all. He concluded that spontaneous generation fully explained the origin of life, and he also taught that all living organisms gradually evolved by the process of trial and error and recombination of animal parts. How does that work? He also believed that natural selection was the primary mechanism of evolution, the fittest being more likely to survive to pass their traits on to their offspring. He got that right. Natural selection, we're not afraid of. That is a scientific fact that it can be observed. It doesn't explain. Survival of the fittest doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest at all. So the pagan religions, they all were basically the same. I'm not going to go into each and every one. And they had the idea that the universe, of course, was eternal, and that these gods arrived and started this all on. And they were all part of the all part of the creation, and really it's a pantheistic type idea is what they had, that all is God, and you have this God power inside of you. That's the big news. You have this God power inside of you that created the universe and caused everything to evolve. That's the power behind it, and all is one, and that the power of the universe is in everything. Here's a couple of quotes looking at the Hindus. Their ancient texts were the Vedas. They say they're really old. I don't think they're that old, but anyway, by tapas, heat, the power of meditation, Brahma, it attains expansion, and then comes primeval matter, and from this comes life. Here's heat, Brahma. This is the creative principle that's inside of each of us, becomes the size of an atomic particle and bring life to this whole universe. These creative processes in succession acquire the attributes of the immediate preceding ones from which they have originated. Each has not only its own special attribute, but also successive ones has the attributes of all the preceding ones. So somehow they're adding on this information, adding on these arms and fins and everything, and brains and consciousness, basically because of the Brahma. Here's the Swami Vivekananda. He was a Hindu evangelist that came around in the late 1800s over here to the United States and England. He said the idea of evolution was to be found in the Vedas, the ancient Hindu scriptures, long before Christian era, but until Darwin said it was true, it was regarded as a mere Hindu superstition. Well, I still regard it as a Hindu superstition. And Hindus were Darwinians centuries before the birth of Darwin, and evolutionists many centuries before the doctrine of evolution had been accepted by the Huxleys of our time, and before any word like evolution existed in any language of the world. That's Sir Williams, professor of Oxford University, 1894. One thing that I came up with in my investigation was cosmic evolution, and see what this reminds you of. First of all, the universe is cyclical. Motion caused an atomic particle to appear. The particle expands and explodes, forming the universe. Out of this evolutionary process begins from primitive to complex life. This process takes over billions of years. Now, does that sound like the Big Bang to you? I wonder if they twisted the evidence to match this ancient Hindu idea.
Where did that particle come from?
The Brahma.
Where did that come from?
It was always there. It's a problem. 19th century Hindu philosopher Sen observed, lo, the Hindu avatar rises from the lowest scale of life through the fish, the tortoise, and the hog to perfection of humanity. Indian avatarism is indeed a crude representation of the ascension scale of divine creation, Brahma. Such precisely is modern theory of evolution. So another quote, and this is kind of so you can understand what's coming over in Eastern mysticism with the New Age in our own country. And he kind of explains it. Do you hear what your modern scientific men say? What is the cause of evolution? Desire. That's Darwin's idea. The animal wants to do something, but does not find the environment favorable, and therefore develops a new body. Who develops it? The animal itself, its will. You have developed from the lowest amoeba. Continue to exercise your will, and it will take you higher still. The will is almighty. It is almighty, you may say, why cannot I do everything? But you are thinking only of your little self. Look back on yourself from the state of the amoeba to the human being. Who made all that? Your own will. Can you deny then that it is almighty? That which you made come up so high can make you higher still. What you want is character strengthening of the will. So this is what this meditation is all about. You're trying to strengthen the will. Go inside and get that power that's inside of us that caused us to be the way we are.
Icarus the Greek wanted to fly. Why can't we fly today?
Yeah, that's it.
Because you don't have the will.
You gotta work on that will.
And I've got the weight. I just don't have the feathers.
So anyway, that's kind of a Hindu mythology, and now I want to look onto just all the other mythologies, but I'm just going to look at Greek first. And Gaia was the earth goddess who originated or created herself out of primordial chaos. According to some legends, she gave birth to Pontus, the sea, and Uranus, the sky. And that's all the stories. Basically, they're all the same. They have this one start from chaos and this primordial chaos, and they give birth to this sea in the sky, and then slowly things come from there. Same thing in the Mesopotamian myth, Numa Elish. It started called universe composed of a massive watery chaos of salt and fresh water mingled together, and then these other gods came up. Basically the same story once again. The Egyptian myth in the Book of Ra, they have the same idea coming from the sea, and then the sun god and everything else. It's just all part of the one materialistic world. And when you see all the Egyptians with the half man and half animal, it's all validating their theory of evolution. And they also had the frog god, and one of the plagues were frogs everywhere, and it was a capital offense to kill a frog, and people couldn't walk without stepping on frogs. It was a big problem, and they thought frogs was good evidence of man coming from the sea. I don't know why Darwin didn't use that, but it's as good as anything else he came up with, but he did, and I guess the Hindus didn't have that idea. Just to show the idea wasn't new. The Mayan culture, I think it began around 600 BC. I think it's a little bit before that. Its religion incorporated a streamlined evolution that taught that rain god constructed humans by adding to, thereby modifying his previous creation. And this rain god first made rivers, then fish, then serpents, and last humans. So this idea of chain of being coming from simple to complex was there a long, long time ago. One of the ancient texts is this text. It says the ladder of ascent, starting with species living in water, trees, plants, insects, reptiles, birds, mammals, then human. The whole ladder of ascent, this is one of the most ancient texts that they found. Talk about this. I think it was from the Asian area. Then the oldest were the Samaritan creation myths, and Samaria was Babylon, basically, a long time ago, and they're the first ones to really start writing, I believe, and recording it on clay tablets. And they have the idea the sea goddess Namu is described as the mother who gave birth to the heavens and earth. Evidently, the Sumerians looked upon the primeval seas as the first cause and prime mover of all things, believing that the heaven and earth were somehow engendered in that sea. And so the idea goes all the way back. I think for sure it goes back to the Tower of Babel. And I think Satan in the Garden of Eden tried to get Eve to question God's word. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if the idea that, hey, this earth's been around for a long time was brought up with Cain, and he's like, that sounds pretty good. And it goes way back as far as we could. And there's only two ideas. There's either special creation, a creator and creation separation, or the creator's in the creation, and the creation was eternal and been around for billions of years. So Darwin did not come up with a new idea, and he didn't come up with new science. And I want to go through a few quotes of scientists that kind of validate my idea. First, Karl Popper, and he's a philosopher of science, and I like philosophers of science because they kind of look at the big picture. They look at all scientists, and but evolutionists don't like him. Evolution is not a fact. It doesn't even qualify as a theory or hypothesis. It is a metaphysical research program and is not really testable science. He's right. He's absolutely right. And didn't come up with anything new, and it has still got huge problems. Here's a long quote. It's on 3 pages. This is, he says Darwinian is a Gnostic myth. This is Dr. Wolfgang Smith, physicist and mathematics professor at Oregon State University, is who this quote is attributed. And when he talks about Gnostic myth, he's just talking about basically pagan ideas. And pagan is what the Jewish people came up with a word that we get pagan from for everybody who didn't believe in special creation. So when he talks about Gnosticism, it can mean different things, but it's basically talking about people that are materialists, that think that the world created itself. As a scientific theory, Darwinism would have been jettisoned long ago. The point, however, is that the doctrine of evolution has swept the world, not on the strength of its scientific merits, but precisely in its capacity as a Gnostic myth. People like it because you don't have to answer to a God one day. That's the big problem. It affirms, in effect, that living things created themselves, which in essence a metaphysical claim. Metaphysics deals with origin, and so it is an origin claim. Thus, evolutionism is a metaphysical doctrine decked out in scientific garb. It is a scientific myth, and the myth is Gnostic, because it implicitly denies the transcendent origin of being. For indeed, only after the living creature has been speculatively reduced to an aggregate of particles does Darwinianist transformism become conceivable. So they started from little things and moved on to big things, and that's the way they did it. Darwinism therefore continues the ancient Gnostic practice of depreciating God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. It perpetuates the venerable Gnostic tradition of Jehovah bashing. That's what it was all at the beginning at the Tower of Babel. That's what it was all the way in Cain and Abel. They don't like the Creator God, Yahweh. Another quote from Ernest Mayr, professor of zoology at Harvard University. One belief that all true or original Darwinians held in common, and that was their rejection of creationism, their rejection of special creation. This was the flag around which they had assembled and under which they had marshaled. The conviction that the diversity of the natural world was the result of natural process and not the work of God was the idea that brought all so-called Darwinians together in spite of their disagreement on other of Darwinian's theories. So they're all like the idea that we evolved from nothing, and even when there's problems with it, they find a common cause that we got to stick with this idea. Professor Adam Segwick, a geologist of his day, he wrote this in 1861. He wrote, "From first to last, it is a dish of rank materialism, cleverly cooked up and served up." This was in 1861. And why is this done? For no other reason, I am sure, except to make us independent of the Creator. So he read his book. Within 2 years, he wrote this. James Shapiro said, "For those scientists who take it seriously, Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief system than a testable scientific hypothesis. This quasi-religious function of the theory is, I think, what lies beneath many of the extreme statements that you have doubtless encountered from some scientists opposing any critical analysis of the neo-Darwinianism in the classroom. It is also why many scientists make public statements about the theory that they would not defend privately to other scientists like me." I tell you, it's a big conspiracy. I hate to say it. It was a conspiracy at the time of Darwin. If you want to get a degree, you better believe it. If you want to get a job, you better believe it. If you want to get published, you better believe it. It's all fixed. I talked to a fellow in January. He was his father was a doctor, and his grandfather was a doctor. He went to Texas Tech and was taking pre-med. There was one class they had to take, and the professor was the one who gave recommendations. And anyways, biochemistry. What's the name of it, Judy? What? But everybody, what is it?
Usually biochemistry.
Biochemistry. Anyway, The professor found out he didn't believe in go-to-you evolution. They said, you're never going to go into medical school. And he blackballed him from medical school because of that. How does that have anything to do with medicine? I don't know. And he's a pastor now, thank God. So anyway, God worked it out. Another quote, evolution is unproven and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. That's by Sir Arthur Keith. He wrote the foreword to the 100th anniversary edition of Darwin's book in 1959. I don't think he wrote that in the book. But the problem is they don't want there to be special creation. Here's evolution, Professor Louis Bonar. Evolution is a fairy tale for grown-ups. The theory has helped nothing in the process of science. It is useless. Hasn't helped science, I don't think. I think it's holding science back. Science today, they're spending billions of dollars, take the evidence and twisting it to match the theory rather than looking at the evidence and coming up with the right idea. We're out there spending all this money trying to find life out there. Why? Because they want to prove that life can come from non-life and it could happen anywhere, like it happened here.
That reminds me of someone, I read that Eisenhower decided that the Russians were ahead of us in the space race because our scientists believed in God. And that started the deterioration of science in school. I mean,
Yeah, evolution was taught in schools after that.
creationism in school.
Yeah.
Was we had to get more scientifically geared.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so, but that's exactly what happened. And you wouldn't think he would be the one to do it, you know? But that's exactly true, and that's what happened. Looking at the Bible, Ecclesiastes, the teacher or preacher in Ecclesiastes is Solomon, but he comes to philosophical conclusions based on what he sees around him, taking God out of the picture, and then at the end he says, you take God out of the picture, you got nothing. And he said, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new. This idea has been around since the very beginning. In fact, in chapter 9, he comes to the conclusion time and chance happen to them all. This idea of chance. So he thinks it all comes from chance. That's the only alternative. You either got God, creator God, or chance from the universal, eternal universe. Romans chapter 1:20, looking at a few Bible verses. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. The evidence is there. God has given us the evidence that there was a creator. It's the only explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. It's the only explanation for life itself and just the earth being able to sustain life. For humans, where did our brain come from? Where did consciousness come from? The whole law of cause and effect is violated by this universal law that's been proven since the earliest of times. The big problem is they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worship and serve the created things rather than the Creator, who is to be praised forever. So that's the problem. They worship the created things, the creation, rather than the Creator. We can look at the sun and appreciate God who put it there, but we don't worship the sun. If you are a materialist, you should worship the sun, you know. And anyway, a few other problems with evolution. I myself have little doubt that in England it was geology and the theory of evolution that changes from a Christian to a pagan nation. That's S. Sherwood Taylor, British historian of science and chemist. Another one says William Provine, professor of biological science at Cornell. Belief in modern evolution makes atheists of people. One can have a religious view that is compatible with evolution if the religious view is indistinguishable from atheism. I agree, a lot of people lose their faith after being taught Darwinian evolution as a fact, and it proves the Bible wrong. If you if you're taught that evolution is a fact and it disproves the Bible, you're going to have a hard time believing the Bible. And if you don't have a belief in the Bible, and you don't have a belief in creation, then you're not ready for the cross. Okay, our goal is to get them to the cross. We want to remove the obstacle from the cross. We want to get them ready for the cross, but evolution is a big problem, especially if you spend any time witnessing with people. Bad ideas have bad consequences. I wanted to include this from Henry Morris, who we all love and respect. He said, evolution is the root of atheism, of communism, Nazism, behaviorism, racism, economic imperialism, militarism, libertinism, anarchism, and all manner of anti-Christian beliefs and practice. This is Darwin's dangerous idea. Total different subject, but I wanted to bring it up. That bad ideas have bad consequences. And anyway, Nazism, communism, and racism, and all these others you can look up. It's behavioralism is that you take God out of the picture, that you don't have a sin nature and everything's caused by the environment. Economic imperialism, that countries control other countries economically. Militarism, which is North Korea. They're communists, and militarism, where the people are starving and the military is getting everything they can. Everything's poured into the military. And libertinism is the idea that there's no morality. Anarchism is what we have going on in our country today. Anarchists think that there's no law and everything, if we get rid of law, but it always ends up in tyranny. And bad things happen when bad ideas come. So we as Christians are given this command in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. Okay, this is what we are trying to do at Mios. Trying to do this because we're supposed to demolish these ideas, and hopefully I did a little bit demolishing tonight, and every pretension that sets it up against the knowledge of God, and make it obedient to Christ. And that's what ICR does. That's what the Creation Museum and Glen Rose does, and that's what we are commanded to continue to do. So these ideas have bad consequences. We're seeing materialism take over our country, and now, on the strength of the will, you can become a female if you're a male. Isn't that amazing? Biology says there's all kinds of difference. Well, just put hormones into them, and they can become female, or females can become male. It's crazy ideas, bad ideas. Bad ideas have bad consequences.
Bad science, too.
Bad science. So, in summary, looking back, Darwin didn't come up with a new idea. He tried to promote it as a new idea, as a way to validate it. He tried to say it was science. He called those people who didn't believe his theory the flat earthers. But actually the flat earthers were the pagans back in the day. They were never Christians or believers that believed in a flat earth. And so he tried to say, I have science, this is new science, I've come up with a new theory. But it wasn't a new theory, and it wasn't good science, it was bad science that he came up with this theory. And hopefully I made the case, bringing it to you, the jury, and so maybe you learned hopefully a few things in this tonight. And I enjoyed getting into it a little deeper and putting together a presentation for you.
Great job.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. You started off talking about cause and effect.
Yes.
And I was wondering if in your research you found, or what you found as far as the effect that the death of Darwin's daughter at about age 8 or 10, whatever, she was young, 10, I think her name was Anne, but Emily, okay, and that he was angry at God, and so...
That was kind of the motivation for his change, and actually he went to seminary and he read William Paley's book, and came to believe in God, and that's what they said when his daughter died. He's like, how could this happen with God? And he went back to his grandfather's idea, I think, and that was part of the picture too.
I believe she actually died on Easter Sunday.
Really? But his wife was a Christian.
Emma.
Yeah. And And I think Darwin's mother was a Christian. His father was a doctor, and he hated God too, like his grandfather. All right, any other ideas or questions? Well, let's see. I do have a couple of books up here. I have one book that I have a few of, Our Young Dying Son, that I had a talk about here about 2 years ago. And then I have another one that I wrote for college kids, Reasoning for the Truth of Christianity. So anyway, if you have a college kid, you can have it for free to give it to them. But anyway, the normal cost is about $10. So, all right.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.